In this lesson, we will read an excerpt from Radio Girl and answer a written response question. Now, when it tells us the text is an excerpt, that would mean it's a longer story that has been shortened in length for whatever reason. For this reason, it's because if it's a test and they can't give you something so long to read. Now, what's important when you know it's an excerpt, it might start somewhere in the middle and it might end somewhere in the middle. So the stories that they give you that are excerpts might read like they don't make sense. But we know this one's going to start somewhere in the middle because they gave us background. So they're going to tell us in 1938, when many people are out of work, teenager C.C. Maloney dreams of getting a job as a radio star at Columbia Radio in Manhattan. Now, anytime you see a story taking place in the 1930s, you would want to say the 1930s was known as the Great Depression, when many people struggled with finding a job or just their finances in general. You could say struggled with finding jobs, and you could say staying afloat financially. That would be how you would want to word it. So it was a very difficult time financially in America. You have from 1929 all the way pretty much till 1938, you could say, because that's once America started to get involved in World War II. So the 1940s, that's our World War II kind of decade. And then the 1930s, Great Depression, 1920s, Roaring 20s. But here will be our story. The minute Ma and Nori left for Mass on Saturday morning, I emptied out my skate bag, shoving my skates under the bed as far as I could reach. The bag was my cover. If anyone asked, I was just going to the roller rink like every weekend. I threw my pocketbook into the bag along with my working paper and $1 I had borrowed from Ma's rainy day jar. I would need money for trolley fares and the ferry. Next, I dragged out the least shabby of my blouses and my new school skirt, the only one that fit. I cuffed my bobby socks neatly and laced up my saddle shoes. These would be talking about kind of fashions of the time. Bobby socks, I think they're just like low socks. And she also mentions trolley fares and ferries. We wouldn't call them trolleys anymore. We would call them buses. So that could tell us we are in the 1930s if the text didn't. All right. All week long, I had practiced tongue twisters and read up on Columbia's programs in Radio Guide. All I had to do next was get out of the apartment before Ma and Nori came back from church, drop my skate bag off at Bev's place, then head for 485 Madison Avenue in Manhattan, the office of CBS. 30 minutes later, I had left behind the brewery smells of Newark. I leaned against a damp railing on the Hoboken ferry bound for the 39th Street dock. The mist on the river cooled my face and arms. Waves on the Hudson caught the sun and glimmered like the sequins of a radio star's evening gown. I'd never been across the Hudson by myself before, and the freedom of it made me feel like one snappy piece of work. When the ferry settled up next to the dock, the crew threw ropes around the pilings. Unique New York, I whispered, unique New York. The city lay before me with 7 million future fans, and I couldn't wait to get started. When she says unique New York, that is supposed to be what you would call a tongue twister. So tongue twisters are like tricky things to say, like Sally sold seashores by the seashore. She's practicing her speaking there with the unique New York quotes. The streets were packed with people, shouting, running, hailing cabs. I hurried up to 42nd Street, then headed east, passing shopkeepers, propping open tavern doors, and sweeping the stoops. Wisecracking men unloaded trucks. Horns honked. Bellhops stood outside hotels. And there were already lines at the banks. Flattened chewing gum and old stogies dotted the sidewalks. I passed a Chinese restaurant smelling of boiled cabbage, then crossed another alley that smelled of rotten vegetables and exhaust fumes. On Fifth Avenue, I squeezed past fancy-dressed ladies in wide-brim hats, walking their toy dogs. I passed a Sebert's hot dog cart on the street. There were businessmen in smart suits and fedoras rushing by shabby folk sitting against street lamps, selling pencils or asking for spare change. More horns honked. Motor oil on the street shimmered in the sun. At the corner of Madison and 46, a Buick nearly ran over the toes of my saddle shoes. Finally, there it was, 24 stories high. 485 Madison Avenue, the Columbia Building. Its windows were like mirrors, reflecting the even taller skyscrapers all around. I stood in front for a minute, taking it all in. This was a moment I would always remember, the beginning of my rise to radio stardom. I licked my thumb and rubbed the scuff marks off my shoes, nodded at the doorman, and pushed through the revolving door. As you can see, this wasn't much of a story, right? We don't know if she gets the job. We just know she made it there. And when they talk about the Hudson, so she went from Newark, New Jersey, and she took this Hoboken ferry, and then this would have been the Hudson River to get into New York City. So this would be our protagonist conflict. And at the top, we got her name, Cece. Because if we noticed, we would have never known her name because this story is narrated in first person. Right when it says, I emptied out my skate bag, that's going to tell us that Cece is narrating the story. So she is our protagonist, the main character with a problem. Now, there isn't really any other characters in this story that caused her a problem. So it would be a little tricky to identify, and right here, protagonist is Cece Maloney. And then we can also say our story is narrated in first person. So I would say first person narration, meaning our narrator is in the story. So we would say her conflict, since no one's really stopping her and she doesn't have like an enemy of sorts, we would say it is character versus self, because she is the one that is going on this journey basically for herself so she can get this job. So we could say it would be Cece versus herself because she has to lie to her family about going into New York City and take all these different modes of transportation by herself. So that would be Cece's conflict in order to get to her destination. So now we would have our question. And they want to know, an excerpt from Radio Girl, how do paragraphs 3 and 4 contribute to the story's structure? Now, when our test makers or any our teachers ask us about structure, you can really think of structure as the way the story was built, kind of like the structure of your house. And stories typically all have the same kind of basic structure here. So you could have your exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. Now, with this story, it was an excerpt, so we don't really... The resolution, we could say, was her getting there. We could say... We would then want to find our climax. That would be like the most eventful part of the story. And this wasn't exactly like an adventure story, right? But we could say her arriving, this would be her exposition. We find out that she needs to go there and she's lying to her family and she talks about her clothes, right? Now here she is practicing. So once the event starts, we could say this is where our rising action would begin. here she is, leaving her town, Newark, and taking this ferry to a dock because she also has to go on a ferry. So we could say that's your rising action. And the climax might be when she actually gets into the city, because this is quite overwhelming here, right? The streets were packed, shouting, hailing cabs. So this would be pretty much your climax, her in the midst of the city. And then this, we could say, is our falling action. Here she is getting closer and closer, right? So if it's asking us about paragraphs 3 and 4, we could identify this as its rising action. But if you were taking the test and you didn't remember that structure meant rising action, or that structure had something to do with these parts of a plot, you could reword your question to show it shows her traveling. It's also, we can say, building some suspense, because first, it's one thing to know she has this plan, but in paragraph 3, she really starts to execute her plan. And you could say once she gets onto the ferry, there really isn't any turning back, because she has to go all the way to New York City. That's it. The ferry doesn't really turn around. So we could say paragraphs 3 and 4, and if I go back down here, we can say paragraphs 3 and 4 contribute to the story structure because it is the rising action. And we could also say, that's how you would word this, but you can word it other ways as well. And here we would have our chart conflict. Another possible response here. All right, so structure, if we're talking about our beginning of the story, so the exposition of a story lays out our story setting, right? Another possible answer that we could come up with for our structure, plot, setting, kind of all can go hand in hand. So you can really, when you're talking about the structure of a story, you can talk about its plot, or you could also talk about the setting here. So 3 and 4, we go from her house in Newark, New Jersey to a ferry, and then she gets off and she's in New York City. So if we were going to answer this question, we could say, you want to reword your question first things first. So when we reword our question, that just means we take the question and make it into the start of our answer. So we could say paragraphs 3 and 4 contribute to the story structure because we could say Cece's trip to New York City begins. Well, we could say Cece's trip to New York City officially begins, or we could say trip to New York City begins in paragraphs 3 and 4. Well, or we could just say begins, right? Begins. So then we could say, now I would use my evidence from the text. So I could say one detail that shows this, or I could just naturally word this in, right? And naturally word, I'm not going to point out that this is my evidence, because the test makers will know this is my evidence because it's something that happened. It's a detail from the story. So I could say the story's setting begins at Cece's house in Newark. However, and we could say the story setting begins at Cece's house in Newark, where she tells readers she has plans to apply to a radio job in New York City. And then we can say in paragraph 3, I might even use a quote here. In paragraph 3, we could say she's on the Hudson, right? We could say in paragraph 3, she is on a ferry with the mist. We could use this one. The mist on the river cooled my face and arms. Or we could, I'd never been across the Hudson by myself before. We could use that quote. That's a good one. So if we were going to use, I'd never been across the Hudson by myself before, we could say in paragraph 3, she says, I'd never crossed the Hudson by myself before. And then I would use here, I'll put para 3. That would be my citation. Whenever you use a direct quote, you always want to have a parentheses, and you would say either paragraph or para period. That would be paragraph. Or you could also do the line. If sometimes your test might be in, or whatever your assignment is, might have lines, and you could say line 13 or whatever you would say. So now we could say here, this quote shows that the setting of the story has changed, and this is where we could have mentioned the rising action part. We could say this quote shows that the setting of the story has changed and the story is in its rising action. So that's telling us that the events are getting more suspenseful. So technically here we do have 2 details, but we can add another one. I could say here, if we're going to say she was on the ferry, we could then say in paragraph 4, the setting changes again, right? So because she went from the ferry to actually arriving in New York City. So we could say this quote shows that the setting of the story has changed and the story is in its rising action because Cece is experiencing an exciting moment. This would be exciting. So that typically rising action has tense, exciting moments. Then we could say in paragraph 4, she arrives in New York City. We could say achieve the dream of working in radio. So if I was going to finish this up, right, with one final sentence, we could say paragraphs 3 and 4 contribute to the structure of the story because it shows readers a change in setting and the buildup of the story's rising action. Now, you didn't have to talk about both of these in your response. You could have been fine just saying something about how it shows a change in setting. That has to do with structure. When you're building something, you would have to start with the ground level. You could kind of say when you're building a story has to have a setting. Another thing story's structure has to have, they have to have plot, right? So you could talk about just the setting, or you could also talk about the rising action, if you remember. A lot of times when they're asking about structure, I find it easiest to talk about what's the events of the plot. So you have your exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. You could also talk about the conflict. We could have also said it shows how she is solving her conflict. So in the beginning, her conflict is she needs a career path. She wants to get a job. And her process of solving the conflict involves her getting on this ferry boat and traveling to New York City. So you could also say paragraphs 3 and 4 contribute to the story's structure because Cece starts to go about solving her conflict. As long as you're just talking about what paragraphs 3 and 4, how they contribute to either the story's setting, the plot, Cece's conflict or problem, then you will get, and remember too, you want to use some details. You have to have at least 2 details. We have far more than 2 details. This was a very in-depth response. Your response wouldn't need to be this in-depth, but of course you can always make it this way if you wanted to. But don't feel like you would have to make it this long. But that is how we would answer these questions about structure.